I'm here to talk about why pharma needs a data culture. And before I get into this quote here, just a little bit so you understand where I'm coming from and my lens. Sometime between 2012 and 2014, I got a phone call to go overseas to India to work on a data integrity problem. And I ended up spending 6 years there. And the first introduction I had to this space was walking a facility and seeing garbage bags outside the facility down an alleyway. And it looked like there were microplates inside the garbage bags. So we went over and we gowned up and we opened them up, and sure enough, there were plates, lots of excursions. We traced them back to the lab, and the notebooks were all 0. And so this was a sterile manufacturing facility, aseptic, oncological pediatrics, and they were running a fake lab. So my lens sometimes is a little heavy, and I don't want to bring everybody down, but it is a reality of the work that I do. And now I've spent about 10 years in the fraud sector. We do a lot of hacking. We do a lot of imaging. I can hack your phone. I hacked Jack's last night as payback for our conversation. I got you. But as part of the work as well, we started to get into the solution. So we have a particular lens, I think, kind of coming up from the ground, coming up through the data, and then working on these solutions and these global programs. And of course, a huge part, if not the crux of that, is really digital technologies. So this quote, if you're familiar with it, came from Janet Woodcock. I believe it was at an ISPE conference where she directs pharma manufacturers to build a maximally efficient, agile, flexible pharmaceutical manufacturing sector that reliably produces high-quality drug products without extensive regulatory oversight. I'm sure we all have a deep connection to that. So I'm really kind of taking that as my foundation. I am quality and compliance after all. And so when I look at the data value chain, which some of you have probably seen this in lots of shapes and forms, I like to juxtaposition it against that early quote. And so really what Dr. Woodcock was referring to was the paper that was published, the pharmaceutical CGMPs for the 21st century, a risk-based approach in 2004. If you're familiar with that, it's chock full of all the reasons we do what we do and ways we can do it better. And there's actually a list of bullet points in there, and the first one is adopt digital technologies. In 2005, of course, we heard from Dr. Woodcock. In 2011, 2013, I think it's ISPE that kind of formally adopted digital transformation and Industry 4.0. So that was kind of coming up. In 2022, some of you are probably familiar with the quality metrics program that's been running at FDA. And then this year, we saw the white paper, Quality Management Maturity. I hope you're familiar with that white paper. If not, I'd love for you to read that. And really, this quote above that, in these organizations, this comes directly from the white paper, there are not separate business and quality objectives. They are linked together. And so when I look at this and I think of the data value chain, I see data. Because when I think of quality management maturity, if you are not managing your data, forget it. And I've heard that said here, that you won't be a player in the field. But most important to me, when we go up that value chain, typically we don't see that, and a pharma is the patient. And I work in the space where data points impact the patient. And this is what we do every day. So now let's talk about what is data culture. So why am I talking about this? Pharma doesn't really talk about this yet. But if you look out, do a little research, you'll see across the industry, data culture is really becoming a sharp focus of managing data. And so in early 2013, you'll see that The Economist, and these things are all available online, launched a survey, and it was really about data-driven culture. Again, 2011, 2013, we know we're in the throes of digital transformation. October 2014, Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, talks about a data culture for everyone. He's talking about his organization having the utmost respect for data, but also access, data sharing, a data democracy. September 2020, Elation, if you're familiar with Elation, I kind of dig these guys. They launch another survey where they're looking at the state of data culture, and basically I'm going to just tell you it's bad, but you can read the survey. May 2021, how data culture fuels business value in data-driven organizations. This is another survey launched by IDC. And one of the things they uncover is that when it comes to data culture, health sciences are second to a category called other. And I'm not sure who's in other, but above other is every other industry doing better than we are. 2021, Big Data and AI Executive Survey by New Vantage Partners confirms for us that we are lagging when it comes to data culture. And by August 26th of this year, Forbes launches the rise of data culture. It's here, it's happening. And really what it's focusing on is data democracy and fostering a culture, I'll just read it here, where collectively behaviors and beliefs of people who value, practice, and encourage the use of data to improve decision-making. As a result, data is woven into the operations, mindset, and identity of the organization. So I want to take us back a little bit, what I call a pivotal shift into an old paradigm. If you're in the quality and compliance space, we had a data integrity problem in 2014. It wasn't new, but it was definitely big. And what happened is really the regulators responded with this pivotal shift, moving away from what I'm going to call data integrity requirements, this really sort of siloed one-off, are we compliant with, Alcoa Plus checklist, versus data governance, which was this holistic approach, leveraging ICHQ-10, our PQS, to build in data integrity by design. So this is really following on those by design concepts. And what was really also new about these guidance is the focus on quality culture. We haven't seen that before. I know there's a lot of research on quality culture, but in our guidance documents, we haven't seen that. ICHQ-10 is actually silent on the words quality culture. Interestingly enough, and a pet peeve of mine, it's also silent on data management. So you'll notice ICHQ-10 will talk about critical enablers, risk management, knowledge management, but not data management. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this crowd, without data management, forget it. Forget the others. So why is it a pivotal shift into an old paradigm? Because, and this is a definition for data governance, if you're quality and compliance, you're probably familiar with this definition. It's in our guidance. It's in all the guidance. Data governance is the sum total of arrangements which provide assurance of data integrity. These arrangements ensure that data, irrespective of the process, format, or technology in which it is generated, recorded, processed, retained, retrieved, I'm reading the whole thing on purpose, it's really long, and used will ensure an attributable, legible, contemporaneous, I'm not going to read the whole thing throughout the life cycle, I'm sure you know what it is, and have a big problem with this. Number one, if you are familiar with data governance, I'm familiar with it from DAMA or DMBOK. This is really about digital technologies. But what we did, regulators, is we took that concept and we said it applies to paper. And then we sanctioned the opportunity to work on paper. All you have to do is make sure that you're compliant, that you check your Alcoa Plus checkbox, and you are allowed to work on paper. And your culture just has to be honest about that. And I don't want to minimize the transparency that we're trying to promote with culture, but my challenge with the current paradigm is that it really comes from fraud. And so I think as an industry, when we think of data governance and quality culture, we're worried about fraud. And we're worried about a culture that's going to tell us the truth. And I think that's valuable, but it doesn't help us with our digital technologies. So why not? Here's why. So how does your culture react to augmenting digital tools with paper-based workflows? How many of you see that? Do you work on the floor? So I work on the floor, and I'm here to tell you, as soon as you guys go away and you go live with this system, it's anybody's guess. The drift that you will see, the way the floor interacts, the culture on the floor with these digital technologies is definitely not what you're planning or intending. So we see all kinds of things. We see NA in all kinds of fields, right? We put them there for a reason. We want that data, and eventually we stop getting it. But nobody's checking as long as we're compliant. We augment. We find down the road that we have a gap in the way the digital technology is implemented. So we print out a form from Viva, has a timestamp. You know I printed it. You know how many times I printed it. And then I can do whatever I want. I can collect all the data on that paper that I want. And I'm not using your solution. This is what I see on the ground. How does your organization interact with data management software? Have you noticed, have you seen that a lot of these technologies turn into what I call electronic file cabinets? I don't know how many of you work in that space, but we move away from the whole intent of structured data, and we start to just put all our PDFs in there. And if I need to change the PDF, I download it and I change it, and then I upload a new one. How accurate and reliable are your query functions and capability? If you work in TrackWise or Viva for your EQMS, and you begin to rely on, for example, running queries for data integrity that I'm going to use for my metrics and to drive continuous improvement, and maybe someday to demonstrate quality management maturity, you might observe that if you take 10 people and you ask them all to run that query, you'll get 10 different results every time. This is what we see on the ground. So let's go through some case studies for CMC, because I know that's why we're all here and what we're interested about. So this is our little, just to kind of level set on our foundation and our case studies, I'd love to bring you through some of the things that I do for a living. In 2014 through 2018, we did what we call targeted DI assessments of submitted applications. This is reactive. This is a team of people that sit in a facility, and wheelbarrows of paper documents come in, all the applications, and we go through them forensically. We have to check handwriting. We have to check the quality of your paper. We have to trace it back to your systems. We have to try to find all this data to evidence to the agency that your applications have integrity. It takes a very long time, and in some cases, true stories, I've had one client that had to withdraw 13 applications. We've seen that. There's a patient on the end of that, let's remember. But I've had that scenario over and over, quite frankly, where we've either had to withdraw or we have to manufacture exhibit batches again because we don't have the data. And I want to move away from fraud, because fraud is really a different topic. These are sometimes just very good organizations that have very bad data management. And we get to a point where it's just too late to recover from our practices. In 2019, 2021, we had a client that was getting ready for a PAI, literally walking around the facility, kind of putting the finishing touches, and they came across some boxes. And they opened up the boxes, and there were paper records in there. They related to the lab. And then they found more boxes, and then we ended up with about 128 boxes, and it spanned from 2011 to the current time at that time, which was 2019. And they were literally test data sheets, literally the acquisition of data. And what was puzzling is that the organization has LIMS, MODA, and an EQMS, and an ELN, and an EBR. So why did we have thousands and thousands and thousands of test data sheets, which then had thousands and thousands of gaps, missing signatures, missing results, and guess what? We couldn't find that data. Company's still in trouble, by the way. We're still working on that. 2019, 2022, so this is fun. These are the calls we get today. We get calls from companies, typically startups, getting ready for their first submission, and they ask us to verify their CMC data because they're getting ready to submit in a couple of months. And we ask them, all of it? And they say, yeah, we want to make sure we have data integrity. And we say, okay. And so we start. We write a protocol. We start to kind of work backwards. And eventually what you find is at some point, there was another lab doing a different study. It was overseas. It was a different language. Oh, then we moved. Then we migrated. And I can actually tell you, in my experience, we never finished, by the way, just so you know. we warn the organization, you're not going to like this. 6 months down the road, they don't like it anymore. They decide, forget it, we're going to just take the risk. I'm just being honest with you. And I can't blame them because they can't find their data. That is actually the reality. Or they haven't baked in their data integrity control strategy from the beginning. So as we start to move back, we start to see things like, oh, we didn't need change management then because we were in early phase GMPs. We didn't need data integrity back then. We were in early phase GMPs. So that's, I can tell you right now, you need data integrity when you start. So those are true stories. And really what I'm here today is really to say we need a pivotal shift into a new paradigm. And this is the reason I love the idea of data culture. For me, it is broader than our current understanding of data governance and quality culture. It really is about a fundamental understanding of why we care about our data. And what's very important to me, and I guess I'll run through some of these things on your left, I don't know which side, but for starters, I'd love to reimagine ICHQ 10 with data management as a key enabler. That would be very different. We have good documentation practices, then we jump to our data integrity policy, and then we go to our data governance strategy, no data management. And trust me, I've looked. Look in PICS, they have it in their title, not really in their content. It's all about data integrity or data governance, which is actually not data governance because it really allows you to do whatever you want with paper. Reimagine the business process, not retrofit our old ways of working. Who's going to shepherd this over the long game? When this system goes live and the experts in the system or the SME that you brought in to tell you about how everybody's going to work with this data, it's usually 1 or 2 people, usually not on the floor. Who's going to shepherd that to make sure that we don't ultimately end up just retrofitting our old way of working and turning these management systems and these digital technologies into repositories? Or worse, I can tell you we see comment sections that end up chock full of GXP information and data, but they're in free text comment fields. Can't use it, can't find it. And certainly if we want to think big picture, quality management maturity, meeting sort of this vision that regulators have, we're not even close because we're going to lose that data, I promise you. That's what I do for a living. Reimagine data silos to create data democracies and usable sources of truth. So again, that example when we found all that documentation in the hallways, aside from the gaps, let's imagine that all that documentation was actually complete. It would be considered compliant. It wouldn't necessarily be seen as an issue that you can't get through it. You can't use it. We're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of test data sheets. On the other side, I really want to focus on the patient here. That's kind of my lens, but also the user. So we did hear some questions here and some conversation about what do we do. So I know a lot of us are focusing on quality culture. If you're in that space, you've probably read all the work by ISPE and St. Gallen's and PDA and Forbes and ASQ. Lot of work to tell us that quality culture matters. I think we do know that. I'll be very honest, I'm not seeing a lot of change. And one of the reasons is I don't think we go to the floor. We talk about end users, but my concern is that I think when we talk about the user, we're talking about a person, somebody who's there telling us about how they're going to use the system. And it's not about an ongoing relationship and engagement with those users. I personally don't see where we're kind of leaving our leadership tower and getting below our management tier and really engaging and thinking about how to put into practice our relationship at the ground level over time so that we don't drift away from the intent and, quite frankly, intelligence of these systems. We need a culture that understands the big picture, that understands beyond just from a quality and compliance perspective why I want structured data. What is that going to enable me to do down the road? We're talking a lot about accelerating, we're talking a lot about speed to market, we're talking a lot about quality management maturity, but I have to tell you, on the ground, what we're seeing is a lot of drift and a lot of paper. And again, you know, if I were going to drive a solution here today, I would say we have to get closer to the folks that are working with this system and really put into place culturally, of course, training, but that ongoing support, that oversight, that monitoring, so that we know over time that we're continuing to use these technologies in a way that is actually going to bring to life the vision I think we all have here today. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jack Garvey, and I'm thrilled to be here in Austin, Texas, my first time here to speak with all these incredibly smart people about the future of CMC, and in particular, digital CMC. Thank you to Keir. That was a great talk. It's always a challenge to come after two really impressive speakers, a lot of which the first speaker I didn't even understand half of that talk. So, and I've been doing this a long time, so I'm thinking, man, things are changing. So we're going to talk today a little bit about how to get to a point where you as a company can actually migrate to a digital CMC solution. And it's what I call achieving a digital-ready CMC. So a little bit about me. As was said, I'm a chemical engineer by original training, also an attorney. I started out on the plant floor. I still consider myself a plant floor engineer. It informs what I do on a day-to-day basis. When I work in quality regulatory compliance, to me, it's still about getting product out the door, being efficient, being effective, good solutions, good commercialization, but in a way that meets both your business objectives and the intent and expectation of the regulators. And I believe that that actually can be done. Keir said something interesting. She said, reimagine the business processes, not retrofit our old ways of working. And it caught my attention because it really ties into my firm's brand as compliance architects. And the original thinking there was based on my experience that compliance is an outcome metric, right? You create compliance through the structural decisions you make with your people, with your processes, with your technology. So when we work with clients, we try to basically make changes to their structural frameworks such that they achieve both their business objectives and meet the regulator's intent. I would love to say that that happens all the time. Clients don't often want to do all that investment. So anyway, so that's a little bit about me. So we're going to talk about primarily how to go on the journey to digital-ready CMC. We're going to start a little bit with what does this term mean? You know, it's a term I created for this event after discussions with Yash, the QB division team, and our experience with more what I'd call traditional CMC problems, remediation, data realignment, documentation problems, lack of poor characterization. So how do you take those kind of traditional informed experience, think about the end point of migration to a digital CMC framework, and kind of bring organizations through that. And then we're going to have some questions and discussion. So what is digital-ready CMC? Well, it's a term that is used to characterize the maturity of a development company's CMC function and the systems, practices, processes, and data management that are structured and optimized to implement modern CMC tools to dramatically improve CMC data, documents, developmental and regulatory outcomes. So we're talking about really the systems, the practices, the personnel, the knowledge, the requirement set that you've essentially distilled into what you need to accomplish such that you're ready to migrate to a digital CMC solution. So why do we want to do this? Well, there's a lot of reasons to do this. Some that are tied into being on a digital CMC platform at the end state, but a lot of this activity is beneficial in its own right. The activities that we're going to talk about can help accelerate your developmental and submission timelines. Creating a process structure for what you're doing increases data and development control. Creating insight and intelligence, drive collaboration and development efficiencies, elimination of information and data silos, understanding your risks across your CMC domain, improving development lifecycle management. This is a really important one, increased third-party knowledge transfer and control. So many companies don't do internal development work. They work with a CDMO. There's a lot of challenges with working with a CDMO. If you're not careful, you can lose access to your data. You can have only partial data. You never really get the information you need to really control the data and information as a sponsor to make downstream decisions when you're into the maturity part of a product life cycle. One of the things that's important is it enables organizations to focus on executing CMC and not building CMC. What do I mean by that? A lot of companies now especially are new. There's a lot of science-based startups, a lot of capital sloshing around out there. Companies are starting up on a whole variety of different science-based therapies. So, you get these smart scientists, they say, I've got a molecule, a large molecule, small, whatever. I think it does this based on the modeling. They get it into some early studies. They find out, yeah, we've got good results. Let's get capital, let's get it into clinical, let's demonstrate it, and we're gonna get a product, and we're all gonna be rich, right? Well, there's really a lot of challenges with that because they're missing a whole couple of big parts of that. Clinical's very important, but CMC is really important. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And instead of actually executing on CMC, companies, particularly the new ones, have to build it. They have to create it. And they're not experts in creating this, right? So companies struggle with what are we supposed to do at the same time that they should be really actually executing on the characterization activities and the data collection, aggregation, readiness for a submission. And then finally, having inherent alignment with ICH and FDA guidances. So this is something I've used for a while now, particularly since my background is more in commercial manufacturing control. But again, it informs how we've really migrated a lot, and I've migrated a lot personally into commercialization activities, just because that's where a lot of the pull has been. And one of the things in thinking about, like what Keir talked about, data governance, data integrity, is that the value of a company in an early stage context is about their data. And it's also impossible to get good data unless you think about the commercialization journey in these three buckets: clinical, CMC, and regulatory. When you think about the data that we're generating to get through a regulatory submission, it's really flowing primarily out of the clinical and CMC functions, buckets, systems, however you want to term it. Those flow up, almost like a triangle, into regulatory that creates the submissions that becomes your ticket. And that ticket either gets punched or it doesn't get punched, right? And a lot of companies have had their ticket not punched because they didn't do the fundamental activities in clinical and CMC to ensure that those data sets were robust, they were well designed, they were meeting the regulator's intent. So this is what I call the value triangle, this interplay between clinical, CMC, and regulatory, with the end objective being a regulatory market authorization. That's where you create the value into the commercial market opportunity. So we're now going to talk a little bit about the journey. How do we get to a digital-ready CMC? I'd love to say it's easy. I think what actually surprised me a little bit during the last couple of days were discussions from big companies that are still struggling with some of the elements here. So if you think that large companies are struggling with some of these elements, imagine the mid-sized companies, the smaller companies, the companies that are newer into the space that are really science-focused and not necessarily don't have the experience of years and years of how to do structured processes. So there's a lot of challenges in this space. So we look at this, intent to achieve an improved CMC framework, operating model, to be digital ready in the way that we look at a lot of our consulting projects. And it's really, when you boil it right down, it's pretty simple. You want to assess the situation in front of you. You want to assess the operations. How good are they? How bad are they? What are the risks? What are the problems? What is not in alignment with what you're trying to achieve as an organization? Taking those results, you define the approach on how to fix that, improve that, remediate that, transform that. You then actually build out a plan and build the activities and then execute on the framework that you built. And with respect to a digital CMC readiness, we've looked at it in a way where we've developed a CMC maturity model to inform that first part, and we go through a CMC maturity assessment. We would do CMC maturity improvement planning that are based on the results of that assessment. We then move into a requirements and process alignment stage, and I'll talk about that. In particular, the first three elements here are probably the main parts of this program, as it should be, because that's kind of the planning, the definition, the framework. The latter stages are really kind of more the execution off the definition on how we do this well. So, what is a CMC maturity assessment? Well, if you are going to go on a journey and you don't know where you're starting from, you probably will end up somewhere, but you may not end up where you intended. So, two things are important: knowing where you're going, but knowing where you are. And a CMC maturity assessment really helps us to understand CMC excellence or lack thereof in a framework that is fairly well understood, maturity. So a CMC maturity model, and our maturity model that we developed, characterizes the functions, processes, systems, personnel, and other related elements to classify the effectiveness of a company's CMC capabilities and readiness for migration to a digital platform. It involves assessing the process elements, personnel elements, knowledge elements, the enabling technology elements, and by that I mean it could be just spreadsheets, it could be SharePoint, it could be LIMS systems, it could be paper technology, right? We've talked a lot about paper. And assessing maturity individually and in the aggregate. The important thing about this, and we do this in other contexts in our consulting practice, is this sort of an activity aligns baselines stakeholders, internal stakeholders, to help drive the business case for the necessary investment to achieve best practice commercialization. Now, if you're only going to do one product, one time, one submission, and walk away from the market, I wouldn't suggest you probably do any of this. Just kind of wing it and hopefully get through and least investment. But I don't know many companies that set themselves up to not commercialize more than one product, and generally multiple products, and think of growth. So, this is no different than a investment in a physical plant, investment in equipment. It's an investment, and it reaps the rewards down the road by developing excellence in the CMC process model and going to a digital implementation. You're going to reap the rewards of that down the road with every single product that you bring through the commercialization cycle. So what does our maturity model look like? Looks like a lot of different maturity models. It starts out at a lower level of maturity, immature, goes up to evolving, well-defined, robust, and digital-ready CMC. Now, I'm not going to go through all the individual characteristics there, but from a communication perspective, these results are pretty simple. I'm going to explain what's behind them a little bit the next slide. But it, in essence, tries to characterize for management, essentially, where are we with respect to our CMC program such that we can or cannot achieve our business objectives. So this creates that alignment by going through kind of a defined set of characterization. And I use that term, I use characterization a lot. I use it in the product side, and we've talked a lot about characterization in CMC, but there's characterization in the quality, compliance, and business outcome side. And this is what that is, right? Characterizing how well CMC performs is necessary to improve CMC such that you achieve efficient, effective CMC outcomes that will drive submissions that are first time approved. So the important thing to understand is any maturity model, this maturity model, is directional and indicative. So there is no absolute precision on this. But what's really nice about any maturity model, and this one relative to CMC, is that it has elements that probably 95% of the people would agree upon. Yeah, this totally makes sense. Now, it may not have 5%, but fundamentally you can align on this. And that alignment is so critical to get the organization, the stakeholders, kind of behind what you need to do to achieve a level of excellence. So it doesn't need to be exact, it doesn't need to be perfect. As we all know, perfect is the enemy of good. So you want something that can get you to an improved state quickly. So when we talk about characterization, I always look at a breakdown, and I love to use mind maps. I think they create a great framework for decomposition and characterization. So applying it here, what are the top level elements of CMC maturity? So this is what our model looks like at a top level: information quality, CMC program governance, process structure, personnel, CMO and laboratory relationships, and information organization. Now, behind them are a lot of discrete elements. And these discrete elements, and there are really more behind that as we've evolved this, but these discrete elements inform a structured way to assess your maturity in your CMC organization. But how do we use this? Well, we take that model, that fairly complex model, we run it through a maturity assessment activity. And what does that activity look like? It basically involves speaking to people in your CMC organization, looking at your systems, looking at your documents, looking at your practices, looking at your outputs, looking at your generated end product, whether it's a spreadsheet, whether it's a homegrown system, whatever it is, and assessing that for how well it meets the criteria defined. We run those results through an algorithm that really ends up in a simple to understand score. And that way you can kind of walk through this with a business stakeholder and say, look, there's a methodology behind this, and this is where we are. And we have to make changes. Now, hopefully you won't. But it sounds like, and from what we see certainly with our work with actually even large organizations, which really shocks me, there still is a lot of work to do in CMC processes. And that isn't all that surprising, right? It isn't all that surprising. And I don't look at this as a failure of the industry. Traditional pharma, CMC was just not that big a deal, right? You had pretty simple dosage forms. I mean, I started my career in 1984, and it was tablets, capsules, liquids, transdermals were kind of new. You had sterile products. The characterization model on a tablet was pretty well understood, even on paper. Now, as we've evolved into biopharmaceuticals, complex molecules, complex science, that has changed. CMC has become that much more important because we have to, at the end of the day, create a dosage form or forms, whether it is based on, whether it's, and I can't remember, allotropic or autologous. Based on autologous, I think is where it comes out of the individual and then gets defined and goes back into the person. Allogenic is kind of made in bulk. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. They're still much more complicated, so the dosage forms have to go through a CMC process that really needs to be much more robust, and the characterization is not easy. So CMC has really kind of come into its own, in the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years. So starting after following that assessment work, understanding where the company is, we go through improvement planning. This is not rocket science, but it is structured and it's an approach that can be embarked upon. So we assess the identified gaps, we validate deficiencies with stakeholders. We do a lot of, as I said, we do a lot of consulting work, we do a lot of risk mitigation work, and one of the tools that has become really most valuable are the interviews we have with the personnel to understand what they know about the deficiencies in their own operations. So we always go in and we can help a company do that assessment with our experts, but people know where things are not working. So we validate the identified gaps with the stakeholders. We then prioritize the gaps based on risk and then impact to the value triangle. So our objective, we have an end state in mind here. We want to get a regulatory submission, a market authorization from the regulators as quickly as possible. That's our end state. So we're looking at CMC in that context. Is it suitable to achieve that objective as quickly as possible and as cost effectively as possible? We look at the gap complexity against the improvement objective timelines. So we do a lot when we do risk identification and analysis, we do a lot of work with complexity. What do I mean by complexity? So every time you have a gap or deficiency in your operation, you can put a plan together to fix that, right? But some things are really easy to fix, and some things are really hard to fix. Some things require one department and not a lot of money. Some things require multiple departments, a lot of money, capital expenditure, and 10 years of time to get there. So we characterize that complexity such that we look at risk and objectives in a two-dimensional framework. And what that does is it helps us to characterize low-hanging fruit, right? What are the things that provide the highest risk or the highest impediment to achieving your objective at the lowest complexity? Well, those are the ones you go after, right? The converse is looking at things that are high complexity, going to cost you a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, but they don't have the same impact. Well, you want to put those at the bottom of your prioritization list. And we've done this work for a lot of big clients, and it has really been transformational for a few of them. One that's, frankly, one of the clients here in this room is, and it really helped them align how they're going to approach getting to a better state. So we would apply the same principles here in CMC maturity improvement planning. We then develop an improvement plan and then align the plan to any balance of digital CMC improvement activities. The next step we would take is to align the requirements to the process. So what do I mean by this? So there are requirement sets that exist, or maybe better said, expectation sets, for what you need to achieve with your CMC outputs at the end of the activity to facilitate the regulatory submissions. Now, they would be found, as an example, they would be found in ICH Q8. They would be found in data integrity requirements, guidances. They would be found in any other regulatory requirements in the FDA's QBD guidances, and they may be also your own internal requirements. So we take it and we review and establish those requirement sets and say, what are we going to align to make sure we meet these requirements and expectations? Once we do that, the process actually becomes pretty simple. We decompose those requirements, assess the applicability to the product technology. So if you have a platform technology, if you just have a discrete technology, do these requirements apply? How do they apply? Do they apply differently across different technologies, across different product families, and the regulated product class, which always defines risk? We then incorporate in parallel developmental needs, downstream process and regulatory needs. What does regulatory need to support the submissions? That will also be an input. We then establish the standards for the company, incorporating identified internal and external requirements, and then we cascade that down into a company control framework. Or in other words, the processes, the process documents, the work instructions, the tech stack, whatever the case may be. And what it really looks like graphically is it looks something like this. So at the top, we've got our requirements and our standards. In digital CMC context, we have an enabling technology backbone, which I'll show in a second. So at the requirements and standards level, we have things like the ICH Q documents. We have data integrity We have, I can't actually even see that one, the white, they are pretty light. But MES and other actual inputs to what we want to achieve from our processes and our CMC. We have just happen to have QBD Vision there in our technology stack. And what we need to do is we need to link these. So we need to create a process framework that drives the requirements, the expectations into the use of the technology stack such that it's reproducible and consistent. And I made a note on Chris Kopinski's comment yesterday that when he was talking about data, he said it is a people and process problem. Now, I think there's more than just a people and process problem, but it is a people and process problem, right? We need to define the processes such that we achieve the outcomes that we intend. I have a belief that structured data comes from structured processes. And I think the definition of using computer-based tools requires structured processes because computers don't vary how they present your information to you just because it's Wednesday. They have a process structure. They have an approach for entering information, for migrating information forward, for approving. So you have to have defined processes that mirror that framework. By the way, this all looks very complicated. It can be. All depends on how big an investment you want to make. How big is your operation? How important is it? How many products do you have? This can be scaled back, but the same program elements are going to apply. You can do it in a little activity set, or you can do it in a large activity set. But if you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation that has a commercialization pipeline that is going to yield billions of dollars in revenue, you probably ought to spend a little time on this to make sure it works for you. Smaller companies, they can't afford it, but it can be scaled. These same elements can be scaled to the size of the organization. So these last few steps are they're a little easier to understand. Once we go through kind of the process side, we look at the data side, data aggregation and transformation. So we need to be ready to migrate to digital solutions. So we want to look at our data wherever it may be. It could be, again, in spreadsheets. It could be in EQMSs. It could be in SAP. It could be in your LIMS systems, your developmental systems. You need to look at data contextualization. You need to look at data configuration. You need to make sure it's aligned to your processing requirements. We talked a lot about taxonomy and data definitions. We've done quite a few data projects with clients kind of outside some of the traditional systems. And data definitions are a real challenge. We did some data metrics, some quality metrics work for a large company. And it was a huge, huge activity to align quality metrics definitions across the enterprise. People just did them differently. And people didn't want to change them because their metrics were going to change. Some of them were going to look worse because people game metrics. I know that's shocking. So you've got to do that data definition alignment such that you're comparing apples to apples, or else knowledge from data is not useful if the data is not apples to apples. It's just not. And that's really important. I'd make a mention about real-world evidence, which is kind of an interesting activity. I've spent some time on that. A little troubling if you know how real-world evidence is collected. Anyway, so aggregation requires location, identification, structural normalization, and resolution of inconsistent data formats, field configurations. And then you need to look at, do we need to do transformation forward so that we can migrate to digital platforms? We may have to analyze our data model, and we may need to possibly realignment to ensure we can migrate forward. Keir talked a lot about data integrity and compliance. I know that there's a lot of negativity towards compliance these days. I don't happen to share that because compliance has really driven the industry to where it is now. The industry would not be as valuable. It wouldn't be as successful if the standards and requirements of the regulators weren't strictly driven. Because companies will just do the wrong thing. As Keir said, she spent a lot of time on fraud. If your information isn't reliable, it's no good, and the regulators certainly aren't going to approve your product. So data integrity is not, it shouldn't be the emphasis, it should be your baseline, right? You've just got to do it. And I think Daniel talked about that in the beginning. It's really just a baseline expectation. So you have to look at forward migration into computer-based tools. You've got to look at those controls. So when you're migrating and thinking about migrating after you've done all the data work into your computer-based tools, how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it on change control? Are you going to do it on protocol? You're just going to do it and hope nobody looks at it? How are you going to trace back to source principles? That's something really important to think about. So you've got to think about single entry, multi-use data principles. What do I mean by that? So data is not always generated for purposes that people ultimately want to use it for. And the control environment around that data generation may be loose, it may be moderate, or it may be robust. And depending on that, there may be applicable uses, or there may be uses that are basically kind of out of consideration if you don't have an adequate control. So I had a client one time in the consumer product sector that was doing consumer testing of cosmetics, cosmetic pharmaceuticals type of thing, consumer product testing. And they said, well, we have all this consumer product data, and we found out that it really does this. So we really would like to use this for our regulatory submission. And I went, whoa, time out. I said, what kind of controls did you have doing this? They really had none. They had people with a pen and paper doing things at their homes. And, who knows what kind of controls they had. But they wanted to use that data for a different purpose. So you've got to think about that when you're looking at going to a computer-based tool. Where's that data being generated? Is it being generated with the right level of rigor such that it can be pulled forward to do the kinds of things you want to do with a CMC? Okay, and then finally, once you go through all that in a large, medium, or small approach, that readiness should align to successful outcomes from another assessment. So if you did another maturity assessment, not that you need to, you should be at a higher level of maturity, certainly for being digital ready. That higher level of maturity would indicate a readiness for migration to full digital systems. Those implementation plans to go to these new systems are dependent on which systems you select. They may require further enhancements to your internal systems, personnel training, processes. Keir made a point that that people on the floor often don't do what you think they're going to do, and they may not use the systems you think they're going to use. Couldn't agree more, right? It's not necessarily the system's fault. It may not even be the readiness fault. But you've really got to think about how things are going to be used in an operational setting, and think about how do we ensure that the investments we've made are going to be realized such that the data can be utilized when we're using these new, expensive, robust digital tools. So, and finally, the implementation will really be facilitated by all this foundational work that you do that should really help ensure a level of success. So that's it. Any questions? And I guess we're going to have a panel, so maybe we hold the questions for the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for both two very enlightening talks. So you two, we're going to start off with perhaps like some of the other panels yesterday, maybe trying to pick a fight. You two are obviously...
We practiced last night.
Yes. Forward-looking, thinking folks in the quality sector or quality organizations thinking about how to do digital transformation. On Wednesday, we heard from a keynote, and in that keynote, they said the technology's here, the regulations are here. Maybe the people aren't here, and perhaps even implied quality is maybe too focused on compliance. How do you respond to that? How do you think about that in context to maybe not your organizations, but the industry as a whole? Please.
How do I respond to perhaps quality not being where we need to be? Yeah.
Is that wrong?
I am quality, right? So I live in this space. I think part of that answer is absolutely. But I would say that goes across the board. I think that when you are part of a digital solution, you really understand it inside and out. I think once it gets into pharma and you're not only dealing with quality, but IT, operations, and folks are trying to come together, I think everyone has to raise the bar, quite frankly. If I speak strictly of quality, you've heard my pet peeve on the regulations. I've certainly been vocal about that to FDA directly. They know how I feel about that. And I don't see a whole lot of quality folks thinking outside of the box like that, trying to challenge the way we're being regulated now, trying to kind of hold FDA, if you will, to their promise that we're allowed to use risk-based approaches. But I think part of that is because we're not sure. And again, I'll say we, quality and compliance, we hear a lot about a risk-based approach. We have some ways that we look at that. But really thinking outside the box, what does that mean from a data perspective? I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing that relationship with thinking about not all data is created equal. What does that mean? What does that mean right here, right now? What does that mean down the road? I'm not seeing maturity and thinking outside of the box in that way typically. I know there are definite outliers. I think Steve is an outlier. I've gotten to talk to him and I've told him that, but I don't see it across the board.
Yeah, so I certainly think quality hasn't done itself any favors over the years in how it is approached supporting operational objectives, financial objectives of the organization. On the other hand, I also think that people fail to remember that quality is charged by the regulation. Really no other function, to my knowledge anyway, I'm not, I can't cite chapter and verse every day, but quality was the organization in 1978 with the kind of the major revisions to the GMPs. They're still pretty much substantially in form and function the same. Quality was charged with the role of ensuring that certain activities were done. So, the FDA, the only way that the FDA has to ensure that companies do the right thing is through the law, right? It's one of the reasons I became an attorney with my background, because that's all they have to work with. They have, the only ability they have is to work from the statutory authorization from Congress and then the regulatory provisions that are done in accordance with what's called notice and comment rulemaking. Guidances are something that the agency is used to try to help industry understand. So, I think that quality always gets a bad rap because they have a defined job under the law to do certain things and ensure certain things. They're the ones that sit in the inspections. They're the ones that go across from an investigator that's probing to rightly understand whether you're not the next bad guy, because there's lots of bad guys out there. There's people that commit fraud. They lie, cheat, and steal every day. I tell my clients, it's your job to write documents, to prepare information such that the regulators understand that you're not the next bad guy. That's all they're trying to assess. They actually give a lot of credence when they can trust you, when they see that you have put in the right efforts to approach the work that you do, to put therapeutic products out that people rely on every day. So I don't see it as, I think quality gets a bad rap, but I also don't think they've helped themselves, for sure. There's a lot of, because of that charge, there's a lot of thinking that we don't want to do this because we don't know what that risk is. The other part of that, though, is that I always know people that I don't think really understand how the FDA regulates when they say, what does FDA tell me I have to do? Why doesn't FDA just tell me what I have to do? It's never been FDA's job to tell you what to do. They define certain things that they want to see achieved. It's your job, because you're the experts in your systems, you're the experts in your platform technology, in your science, in your processes. It's your job to frame how you do what you do in the context of achieving the regulatory requirements and expectations. It's your job. It's not their job to figure it out. So I look at it a little differently, and I think that's where companies fail, is they don't realize that they have the job to do. So let's fast forward to digital CMC, right? How do we get there? Well, you got to tell your story, right? So you need to put together, and one of the things I was going to ask Yashka yesterday, and I didn't get a chance because I had to do a call, was whether or not some of the work they've done was, how did they do it? Did they do it pursuant to change control? Did they migrate to systems pursuant to change control? FDA has no, I've seen invariably, FDA is, they're trying to drive innovation. Frankly, I think they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, like why are they pushing continuous manufacturing? That's not their job. But anyway, that's a different topic. It's not their job to push continuous manufacturing. It's their job to work with the manufacturers, so something's going on there. But they're open to that if you tell the story. So when you're thinking about migrating a traditional CMC framework to digital CMC, you've got to put a story together on how what you're doing now in this migration and this transition will achieve better outcomes that meet the requirements and expectations of the regulator. It's just that simple. Then they won't care.
Great, that's awesome. And let's flip that around quickly. So how, and Kerr, you asked this question yesterday to the panel, but so from the other side, how should, we have some forward-looking folks in the room, but how should they partner with quality? What should that conversation be? And you both talked about culture and data frameworks at the high level, but let's maybe talk a little bit more about the soft skills. How do you bring them into the equation? How do you take those people and make them successful together?
Please.
I think part of it is, or a big part of it is really helping quality understand and who's helping them understand. So let's assume that it's the solution provider coming to the table. But remember, it really is a give and take. So part of the give and take is you don't know my process the way I might know my process. If I'm quality, I may not know the process the way manufacturing might know the process. There's quite a relationship there. So I'd say breaking down those silos, really coming together, and what I might need from you or what quality might need is a much better understanding of what is structured data, what does that mean? I don't think we talk a lot about that. We train people on how to use a system, but we don't necessarily talk about what happens if we drift from that. I don't even know if we'd know that was drift. So I can tell you real examples where quality will document reasons for changes in a comment field, and technically that's compliance because my justification is documented. And there's not going to be an understanding of why that is a drift away from what I can do with structured data. And because it's not necessarily seen as a compliance issue right now, but I think there's a gray line because if we look at quality management maturity, and that's all about operating above the minimum, if I speak strictly about data management, to me that's above the minimum. I establish very clearly from a quality perspective and operational perspective what the compliance requirements are, and then I talk about here's the step above. Here's how we need to interface with this system over time to assure that we are constantly building a data set that we can use and that we don't have surprises. I think we do see those surprises in paper, this real cultural love of paper. Also a cultural idea that it's easier. I think that's part of it, really addressing very specifically those cultural attributes. Why is paper not easier? Do we really sit and talk about that? That I think there's so much data entry, there's so much pre-work. This feels tedious when you're accustomed to using paper. But we talk about cell phones, for example, and I think that's funny too. I think there's a way to bring it to quality. If we talk strictly about quality, again, I think it's everyone.
Could you unhack mine,
I can't unhack it yet. And I think, we took our cell phones and nobody said boo.
Right.
And if you have a bug in it or something isn't working, nobody says boo, we wait, we do an update. Maybe we're like, oh, this is so annoying, my phone needs an update, it's a little buggy. But when you're in the compliance space, and I get it, we have patience and we have high regulations, but I think we overreact to that. I think we somehow all of a sudden when it comes to a digital solution, there's this idea that it has to be perfect when paper is just so bad. Right. I don't know that we're looking at that. I mean, paper's just so bad, and I don't know that we're really talking about that. We're allowed to use paper. Everybody's doing it. The most advanced companies are using paper. And I'm not saying we can stop overnight, but I do think we should build awareness around why very specifically we don't want to use paper, what it does to our structured data set, and what it does to the goals around quality management maturity if we're really going to be looking to be able to very quickly access our metrics and access evidence that we're operating above bar.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I want to make sure I understand the question. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just, we obviously talked from the perspective of, where is quality part of the problem in the first question. In the reverse, how do the organizations partner with quality? What are some of the things that people can do in this audience where we're trying to bring new solutions to bear? How do they work well with quality?
Sure. So I think that I think the first thing is to understand that quality has a job. Now, they actually have two jobs, and a lot of people have spoken to this dichotomy, but they have a defined job by regulation, which is compliance. That's not going away. They, in theory, should have a dual job of quality in the more traditional context of what you would experience in industry outside a regulated enterprise, right? The problem quality has had is that the pain driver has been focused on the enforcement side, on the regulatory compliance side. That's why quality has grown up to be a regulatory compliance entity as opposed to a driver of continuous improvement pursuant to Deming and all the different quality gurus over the years. A lot of the reasons why in probably the 90s and 2000s that there was a lot of Six Sigma initiatives going on throughout companies, process excellence, driven by operations. Quality didn't drive those, right? Because they were frankly busy enough trying to achieve the regulatory compliance requirements. And the companies, look, traditionally, pharmaceutical companies did not care about costs. I mean, I remember early in my career, back in the late 80s, when I was an engineer at that time, working in validation, process improvement, talking about efficiencies, computer-based tools. And, I had this old codger say to me, Jack, you don't really understand. They make so much money, they don't really care about this. And I've seen not a lot to show me that isn't actually true. As long as they get product to commercialization and market authorization, most executives, they want to ring the bell on Wall Street. They want to go to market launch parties. They want to go to sales meetings. Manufacturing, operations, quality, compliance, they'd rather have their teeth pulled. So it's just not something that most executives are really all that interested in. Now, obviously, they have to do it because that is part of getting products commercialized. But, I would say that it's not outside the technical people, the people, I would say in this room, other people that understand the linkage between profitability, between patient success, a lot of people just don't have an interest in it. So I would say that understanding what quality's role is, understanding what quality can do, and also that when they say no, that they may say no, but there may be ways to approach that differently. They've just got to work with quality. They've got to ask for different ways to approach it and not look at it as that, okay, it's an organization that is just obstructionist. Because, and I will say that, as I said, quality does own a lot of that. There are a lot of quality people, unfortunately, that can't look at risk-based principles, that don't look at their role as facilitating the organizational business outcomes at the same time as they're mitigating risk. So it's kind of a mixed answer there.
Education and partnering. Okay, I like it. Yeah, that's awesome. Go to the audience. We've got one here. Okay, it looks like Yashka, if I can see him.
Is it on? Yeah. I have one question regarding the paper. So you mentioned it's so bad, right? And I, to some extent, agree. But I think the beauty of paper is that you can still be really quick and it's cheap, right? Especially at the beginning. And what I keep seeing is that when you have a multi-product facility that has to change a lot, that the systems that are in place, and I think we discussed it yesterday also in the MES sessions, right, are too rigid, too slow to adopt, and companies cannot afford to go away from paper and wait for the systems to be ready, validated, this kind of stuff, right? So do you think we need the iPhone for the manufacturing world or something like that, so that the people will immediately say, oh, this is better than paper and faster than paper, so we will use it?
Was that to me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to depart just for a second. So one of the things we're seeing with younger people that are coming up in manufacturing, and these are just fundamentals, but they're not filling out logbooks. We're seeing this huge spike in these logbooks, and we think it's because they don't work with paper, right? The younger you are, the less paper you work with in your life, and this is a reality. So when I think of culture and I think of your question and an iPhone in manufacturing, I mean, exuberantly, yes, that's where I would go because I love digital technologies and I love what we can do with data as long as we structure it. And are we there yet? Obviously not. I work a lot with FDA trying to also explore for myself. I don't have all the answers, but we need a huge shift in the way we work. There's so much fear over those types of technologies, just absolute panic. And part of that is just really reinforcing why paper is not working and why it will continue not to work and why the younger workforce won't work with it. They're doing a worse job, I can tell you, because I see it, and it's not intentional, but they're not even accustomed to that kind of default paper mechanism the way I'm going to say I am. I come from paper. We're seeing more of that. This is why I love the idea of digital threads and digital stacks. I just love it. I hope to remain a part of this mission for as long as possible. Obviously, from a data integrity perspective, we know it's better. There's just fundamentally better, fundamentally less risk, but also just in terms of all the other objectives we have, I would love to see that. I would love to see all of that built up as much as possible from the ground, automated. But I do want to talk about quality real quick because quality role, I think one of the big challenges is we work so much in what I call a narrative space. So if you're in manufacturing, you might have MES, you might have an automated process. We work on investigations, right? What do we do with investigations if they're 10 pages long, 20 pages long? It's all unstructured. We have photographs. These are really different types of tools that quality is using. So I do think for quality, to help quality, we have to be thinking about what we actually do and how can we make that better digitally.
All right, well, we're at time, it looks like. Okay,
Excellent.
thank you guys. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Sorry, we got a couple last
Appreciate it.
questions.
Oh, we do have one.
Apologies. Sorry.
Sorry,
This is
I
blinding.
need to ask this question before we close. I think that will set a segue into the breakout session when we talk about CDMO. I want to ask the panelists about the data ownership, especially we're moving to more of a digital space, where you draw the line when you go into contract manufacturing. Who really owns the data? And where can we draw a line? And Jack, you also mentioned about data accessibilities as well.
Yeah, I'll take that because that's an area that I have a lot of concern about. Data ownership is really critical. I mean, your data is your value, particularly for early stage companies or any commercialization part of a large company. Your data is your value. When you're working with CDMOs, and in particular working in a cloud system, that you may be working collaboratively on data, you better have attorneys that understand SaaS digital systems, that understand the relationships between CDMOs and your internal sponsors, the relationship of the respective quality management systems or the developmental systems, and it better be crystal clear who owns that data. Who owns that data? What happens when you want to get that data out? What happens if you want to migrate forward? Where are the costs? It is critically important. And I don't know what the agreements look like. I haven't seen them, but I do a lot of agreements. That would be something that I would be really, really focused on. And if I wasn't satisfied, I wouldn't move forward with it. It's just too important. So that's what I can tell you.
So there is no such a law, compliance law to govern one or the other in terms of the data ownership, but more focus on the agreement between both parties. You got to spell out in the agreement.
The FDA would expect you to have that data, but that's different than the contractual relationship with a service provider, which is not governed. The FDA regulatory framework does not define the contractual relationship between two commercial entities, right? You can do whatever you want. Now, you as the sponsor is ultimately the one that's going to be held responsible. So if they don't have data that they need, if they don't have data that carries forward in a life cycle, and they didn't get ownership of that through their contractual negotiations, shame on them. They're going to have a problem down the road. So it's something that you've got to define before you move into any third-party data stewardship, regardless of the entity. You also want, then you get into all the data control, where is the data going to be stored? Is it offshore? Is it onshore? I'm sure that QB Division, I haven't talked to Yash about it, but I'm sure you guys handle that in a way that is well-defined and well-structured, but the sponsors have responsibility for that.
Hi there. Yeah, I got one more here. Sorry. Further to Yashka's question about paper and how, I guess the question is really broadly, how do we best get rid of paper? When I say paper, I would also include the Word documents that are left on company desktops, the Excel files that are sitting there floating around. Back in the day, we actually literally walked around and got rid of pencils. We went into everyone's desk and took the pencils. We took their whiteout. I mean, some of us even took away the black pens. We talked about this on the first day as well. But is that what we have to do, you think? Or what are the other ideas other than just an iPhone in everyone's hand?
That's you.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly.
Are you asking me if you have to take everybody's pens away? Was that the question? I mean, I think you'd come to a screeching halt, to be honest with you, if you tried to suddenly take paper away. I think culturally getting folks really clear. So again, I come from the fraud space, and I can tell you people are just shocked and devastated when we show up and we image their desktops, and we take a look at when they're generating Word documents. We compare them to when the documents are executed. We have rampant backdating, and a lot of it is really just because companies don't know. Or there's rush, and quite frankly, they forget. Sometimes they print out from a different version. So I think for me, before you take the pen away, and I agree with you, I think Microsoft Word is paper, essentially. Before you do that, maybe just help folks, because you need the tool right now. I mean, I really do believe that. But help folks understand from a data management perspective how to use them, I'm going to say responsibly, in compliance, and in a manner that you're thinking long-term about that data. If you're going to use paper, what we see a lot of is then all the transcribing into Excel sheets, because basically you want to do what a structured data management system will do, which is to pull all your trends and to get what you need to know out of that. But now you've created this, what I call sort of like this slow data value chain, right? It's really slow, really prone to error, and it might just not be compliant. So I wouldn't take it away, but I would definitely get into how do we use this responsibly from a data management perspective in the interim, and keep it as in your risk management. This may be a risk for an organization. We don't see that now. So companies are real interested in risk registers, but we don't see paper as a risk. And to me, paper is a risk, and it should be managed as a risk. Revisit it, revisit it, revisit it, make sure your mitigation strategy is right, and make a plan for when you're going to be able to leave paper in favor of some of these technologies.
Can I make a comment on that, or do I have time?
Yeah.
So just to expand on what Keir said, so when you're looking at let's say something, technology like QB Vision, I mean, to some extent, QB Vision is the lowest common denominator now, it's a great platform technology, it's innovative, all the things we've talked about, but there are still variabilities in companies' implementation that are going to be different, right? What activities they do, what products they develop, what kind of offices they exist in, what kind of desks they use. There's always differences. It's that last mile, to use a telecommunication analogy. You can run fiber from pole to pole, but you still got to do that last mile to the house. That delta is where you need to structure and think about the business processes, right? What are the business processes that we currently do? How do I put control over that last mile such that I can use this predefined process that will really drive value? So that delta is critically important in that digital transformation. And you really need to look at, let's say, individual workstations. How are people doing their work? What do they need to do their work? What do we need to provide to them to do their work? And how do we control what we need to provide to them to facilitate their activity set. So that may need to be done on an individual, on a personal basis. Some people may have disabilities. I have a son with a disability. It may be knowledge-based, it may be function-based, it may be department-based. But you've got to look at that and create those control frameworks for that last mile.
Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.